This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether it's your new profession or just a lifelong passion, start your journey to website glory with Squarespace. Check out their amazing all-in-one platform through the link in the description below. More about them in just a bit. Few stars shine as bright as Betty White. From the age of 17, she fought for her place in a male-dominated industry and sustained a career that lasted as long as her life. The icon was beloved by Hollywood, the stars that dominated the box office, and the audiences who'd watched her for as long as they can remember. The pioneer of early television lived an incredible life filled with love, laughter, heartbreak, success, and failure. The only thing that ever changed was Betty White's unbelievably cheerful nature and incredible sense of humour. White was a game changer in the entertainment industry, but it extends well beyond the bounds of television. She was not only an actress and producer, but she was also an activist for animal rights, racial equality, and LGBTQ+ rights. Betty White not only became a household name several times over, but she also became America's grandmother, a funny, sometimes unpredictable force of nature who refused to go quietly into the night. She lived her life the way everyone should try to live theirs, with a drive and tenacity to live it to the fullest. On January 17, 1922, a star was born in Oak Park, Illinois. Her name? Betty Marion White. Betty was an only child living with her mother, Christine Tess, and her father, Horace Logan White. Her mother was a homemaker, while her father worked at an electrical company in Oak Park and later Alhambra before ultimately moving to Los Angeles. Betty White's childhood was not all that different from a standard upbringing during the early 20th century. While she'd later have a life filled with excitement, her childhood was incredibly normal. She attended school in Beverly Hills and dreamed of becoming a forest ranger. This love of nature and animals was instilled in her from a young age by her parents. They'd often vacation to Yellowstone, ride horses, camp, and even had some 26 dogs. Unfortunately, during a majority of the 20th century, women weren't allowed to serve as rangers. Her next career path was to be a writer. Eventually, however, White found her true calling: performance. When Betty White graduated from high school, she went on an experimental television program with her friends. The two sang songs on what was a new form of entertainment that hadn't yet been fully realized. She'd tasted the idea of being a star, though, and she wanted to chase the dream. In 1941, the US entered World War II, and Betty White became a volunteer and spent much of her volunteer time driving a PX truck with supplies. But of course, Betty never shied away from performing and often did events for troops that were about to be deployed. It was a dark time in history, but it's also where Betty met her first husband, Dick Barker, a P-38 pilot in the US Air Force. Unfortunately, the marriage wouldn't last long, as Barker dreamed of embracing a simpler life post-war in Ohio, while Betty was ready to take on the world of show business. This would become a common thread for White, who was a self-proclaimed workaholic, and nobody was going to stand in the way of her reaching unprecedented heights. As the war subsided, Betty White wanted to take her dream and make it a reality. She started making her way around Hollywood and hoped to land herself in a movie. She starred in a couple of plays and eventually just stuck around hoping to get a job. Eventually, White was told by a producer that in order to get hired, you'd need to join the union, but in order to be in a union, you needed to get a job. The producer gave Betty her first job, which was a commercial that didn't even pay enough to cover the entry fee into the union, but her father, supportive as he was, gave her the remaining amount to get her foot in the door. Television was taking off on the East Coast, but it hadn't yet reached the West Coast, and White wasn't getting into films. So she started turning her attention to finding a job on the airwaves. Soon she started booking commercials, bit parts, and even things like crowd noises. After a few jobs on popular radio shows at the time, like This Is Your FBI, Blondie, and The Great Gildersleeve, Betty was offered a radio show of her own. The Betty White Show wouldn't be her big break, but it was the start of a blossoming career. During the 1940s, White would marry again, this time to talent agent Lane Allen. The marriage was another short-lived affair, only lasting 2 years. Allen wanted to start a family, which meant Betty would have to leave her dream of show business behind. White was dedicated to her career, and she couldn't sacrifice the gains she was making in the industry. The two separated in 1949. In 1949, she soon booked a role co-hosting Hollywood on Television with Al Jarvis. It was a live TV variety show, and by 1952, she took over hosting the show solo when Jarvis departed and his replacement resigned. Television back in the 1950s wasn't like it is today. Hollywood on Television was a 5.5-hour show that aired 6 days a week. While her co-hosts had to jump ship for other projects, Betty White was always ready for a challenge, and she was rewarded for this challenge with an Emmy in 1951. White had always been a go-getter. If life wouldn't give her a break, she'd make it herself. So come 1952, on the heels of taking over as sole host of Hollywood on television, White banded together with writer George Tibbles and producer Don Fedderson to co-found Bandy Productions. The trio would work on taking characters from the variety show and creating new shows and properties out of them. Together, they created Life with Elizabeth. It was a live variety show at first, which turned into a sitcom, becoming Betty White's first foray into a medium she'd dominate in later years. The series was live before going into syndication from 1953 to 1955. The show was a low-budget sitcom, one of the earliest examples of such a show. It became incredibly popular in its time. Life with Elizabeth not only was a success with audiences, but it won Betty White her first regional Emmy in 1951. White was doing something that wasn't all that common back in the 1950s. She was a woman in television with a great deal of control over the series she starred in. She was hands-on, both on and off camera. Her tenacity and desire to do it all were quickly establishing her as a force to be reckoned with, even if nobody had truly noticed her yet. As is show business, Life with Elizabeth met its end with only 2 seasons and 65 episodes produced. Despite its popularity, producers felt that it wouldn't make financial sense to continue. At the same time Betty White was doing Life with Elizabeth, she was also leading The Betty White Show. It was like the radio show of the same name, but this time it was a daytime talk show format. Once again, White continued to have immense creative control over the project, and she used it wisely, like hiring a female director. Sometimes the creative control and decisions she made weren't to everyone's liking in what was a politically fraught time in United States history. The 1950s weren't friendly to everyone in America. The civil rights movement was taking shape and coming to a head across the nation. Betty White and the show endured immense criticism for her decision to include Arthur Duncan as a regular cast member on the show. Duncan was an immensely talented tap dancer, but he was also an African American, which didn't fly for some viewers. The complaints got ugly when southern states heavily practicing Jim Crow had threatened to boycott if he continued to appear on the show. Betty White famously responded in a way fitting of the legend herself. She released a statement saying, "I'm sorry, but, he stays. Live with it." To rub it in, she gave Duncan even more screen time. As the year progressed, NCB kept shuffling the show around to different time slots, and slowly the audience dropped off. Come 1954, they cancelled the series. Many theorized that her insistence on bringing race into the show played a part in its demise, but there's no definitive proof to support any potential reason for the show's decline in ratings. Following the cancellation of The Betty White Show, the young star would go on to lead Date with Angels, a series Betty White mentioned later on in life was the only one she wanted to escape. However, her time on the series led to her meeting and becoming close friends with Lucille Ball of I Love Lucy fame. This could have been considered a slow few years for White, but the best was still yet to come. This is the age of creation. If you think about it for a moment, you realize that everyone on the internet is not just consuming stuff anymore. We're not just reading blogs. We're not just watching YouTube channels. We're making blogs. We're making YouTube channels. We're out there making stuff or selling stuff, setting up a store. And look, whenever you want to do any of that stuff yourself, well, if it involves a website, Squarespace is absolutely the place to do it. And maybe you're the hands-on type. You've got lots of opinions about what exactly your website should look like. If so, great. Squarespace gives you all the customization options you could ever want with no updates, no patches, no technical nonsense to worry about. Or maybe you just need something functional, something that's going to work very quickly. Well, in that case, just use one of their beautiful templates. Boom, boom, boom. You go in, you customize it, easy, and it's done. And once you're done setting up that website, locking in the name, maybe playing around with the design, whatever, Squarespace provides tons of extra stuff so your site can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 customer support, everything you need in one place. So when you're ready to get started on the next project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, do it with Squarespace. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your new site, go to squarespace.com/biographics and you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now today's video. Starting in 1958, Betty White began a long string of appearances on talk shows and game shows. This began with Just Men, The Tonight Show with Jack Parr, To Tell the Truth, and on the Password series, starting with the original Password. She was a staple guest in almost all 3 of these shows, but the most meaningful and memorable was her many appearances on Password. It was on Password in 1961 that Betty White met her third and final husband, Password host Alan Ludden. This wasn't like previous marriages Betty White had had. This one would last a lifetime. Ludden already had 3 children from a previous marriage, and the two were both career-driven individuals. It was a match made in show business heaven. Their connection was instant and visible to anyone who watched them on Password. They continued spending time together for several months, even working on a play together and meeting his kids. Ludden would jokingly ask her to marry him, but one day it became much more than a joke. White would say no for a year and a half before finally saying yes and marrying him in 1963. Betty White would later admit that she regrets not saying yes sooner because it meant she wasted a year before she could have been with Ludden. Following their marriage, White continued to appear on the subsequent Password shows like Password Plus, Super Password, and $1 Million Password. Because of her relationship with the host and her countless appearances, White was eventually dubbed the First Lady of Game Shows. The 1960s had shaped up to be a great decade for the actress. She'd married the love of her life, featured on many game shows, panel shows, and stage shows, and even made her film debut in the 1962 film Advise and Consent. She was also an anchor on NBC's breakfast show Today. While initially interested, the thought of moving to New York caused her to decline the job, which eventually went to a young, wide-eyed Barbara Walters. The late 50s and most of the 60s were some of White's collective 19 years as a hostess, commentator, and contestant on game shows. Then came the 70s and 80s, where White would experience a career leap that would take her from the First Lady of Game Shows to the upper echelons of sitcoms. The early days of television gave birth to some of the most iconic sitcoms in history. Sitcoms like I Love Lucy, Bewitched, Maude, and The Mary Tyler Moore Show were considered to be some of the best of the best. In 1973, Betty White began appearing on The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and she became so popular playing Sue Ann Nivens that eventually her guest role turned into a full-time gig come season 5 onwards. Betty White's very existence on The Mary Tyler Moore Show resulted from Mary Tyler Moore's intervention. They wrote the character of Sue Ann Nivens as someone who was as sweet as Betty White, while also being vicious. They began their search, but eventually Mary Tyler Moore, who was friends with White, suggested they just hire her instead. There was a slight reluctance at first by the producers because of the existing friendship between the two stars, but eventually it was undeniable that she was made for the role. White garnered major success thanks to her run on the show. She won 2 Emmys back-to-back for her work in 1975 and 1976. The Mary Tyler Moore Show wrapped its 7th and final season in 1977, leaving White without an ongoing job. For a while, Betty appeared on a short-lived reincarnation of The Betty White Show, various sitcoms, talk shows, panel shows, game shows, and even some movies and miniseries. In 1983, she achieved another career first, and that was winning the Daytime Emmy Award show for Outstanding Game Show Host for Just Men. The mid-1980s would bring Betty White her most important role to date, the role that truly gave her the recognition she'd long deserved. First, she'd have to endure heartbreak that she'd never felt before. While Betty White was about to walk into one of her most successful ventures, the 80s brought heartbreak. At 63, Alan Ludden passed away after battling stomach cancer and a stroke. White never remarried, and she stated in a 2011 interview that, "I had the love of my life. If you've had the best, who needs the rest?" After the initial grieving period, Betty did the only thing she knew how to do in moments of pain: work. In 1985, Betty joined the cast of The Golden Girls. She starred alongside Bea Arthur, who garnered success playing Maude in the series of the same name, Rue McClanahan, who also starred in Maude and worked with White in Mama's Family, and a fairly new actress in Estelle Getty. The series followed the lives of 4 elderly women in Miami, Florida. Betty White played the naive and slightly daft Rose Nyland, a St. Olaf, Minnesota native. The Golden Girls enjoyed one of the most successful runs in television history. It lasted 180 episodes over 7 seasons, winning the cast many awards and nominations for Golden Globes, Emmys, and more. Betty White herself received 1 Emmy over the course of the series' run, but was nominated each season, as well as receiving 4 Golden Globe nominations. Betty White almost played the seductive Blanche, and Rue McClanahan almost played Rose. This would have essentially typecast them, as they both had played these kinds of roles in their previous sitcoms, The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Maude respectively. The director of the pilot, Jay Sandrich, suggested they switch roles. He only directed 1 episode of the series overall, but his change would set the foundation for a highly successful run. The show, while about friendship between its main ensemble members, wasn't all perfect behind the scenes. Betty White and her co-star Bea Arthur famously didn't get along as well as their characters did on screen. White would often explain that Arthur just wasn't a fan of Betty's upbeat attitude and that it made them butt heads. In 1992, when the show ended, it wasn't because of a decline in ratings or quality, it was a decision made by Arthur to bow out of the role. She felt that it was time to move on. 1992 saw the finale of the long-running series, where 27.2 million viewers watched and said goodbye to the Golden Girls. There was an attempt to keep it going as a spin-off called The Golden Palace. It followed 3 of the 4 main characters as they attempted to run a hotel. The show didn't see it to season 2, but White made a few more appearances as Rose Nyland in Empty Nest and Nurses before retiring the character for good. Coming off a highly successful series like The Golden Girls doesn't mean it's over. Once the show ended and the subsequent spin-off was dead, Betty White did what she does best: guest starred in a bunch of series. She continued garnering Emmy nominations and wins for some of those guest spots like Yes Dear, My Name is Earl and The John Larroquette Show. White would also have some recurring characters in shows like The Bold and the Beautiful and Boston Legal. White made a return to the latest version of $1 Million Password in 2008, as well as many appearances on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno and The Late Late Show with Craig Ferguson. It was during this time that Betty White's fame plateaued. It had been well over a decade since Golden Girls ended, and despite the guest spots on many television shows, she wasn't the household name that she once was. However, a few upcoming roles would start a Betty White revolution and resurgence in popularity that would last until her death in 2021. 2009 was a major year for Betty White. It saw an unlikely resurgence in her career that lasted over a decade. It started with a role in the romantic comedy The Proposal. In the film, White played Ryan Reynolds' grandmother. The film wasn't a major hit with critics, but the everyday moviegoer couldn't get enough of it. Another major moment was Betty's involvement in the incredibly popular Snickers ad, which was featured at the Super Bowl. The combination of her role in The Proposal and the Snickers ad led to a grassroots effort to get Betty White on SNL as the host of an upcoming season episode. The campaign, which was hosted on Facebook, gathered 500,000 members. Eventually, White was confirmed as host for the upcoming season, and she became the oldest person ever to host at 88 years old. In typical Betty White fashion, the appearance on the sketch show landed her another Emmy win. White continued this success by appearing on TV Land's Hot in Cleveland. Initially only slated for a guest appearance in the pilot, White's character of Elka Ostrovsky became her latest leading lady role, which she continued for the series' 6-season run. Again, she garnered a nomination for an Emmy for the role, but she didn't win this time around. During the 2010s, White was keeping herself busy for a woman in her 90s. She starred in a few movies and hosted a prank show called Betty White's Off Their Rockers, for which she received another 3 Emmy nominations. White even won a Grammy in 2012 for the audiobook of her bestseller, If You Ask Me. In 2015, White did another episode of SNL, which would ultimately be her last. She continued appearing in many shows, movies, and documentaries. At such a late stage in her career, Betty White was firing on all cylinders, and that didn't stop until the very end. Betty White's always been a firecracker. She was never afraid to fight for what she believed in, say things that were sometimes unexpected, and make millions laugh almost effortlessly. Throughout her life, she was a major animal rights activist. She wrote books, starred in shows, and created calendars and clothing lines to raise money and awareness for animal rights. It was the one thing she loved more than anything. Betty was also a friend to the LGBTQ+ community who'd grown to love White and her co-stars of The Golden Girls throughout its run and White's performance in The Mary Tyler Moore Show. She was loved by almost anyone you asked, and for different reasons, but the foundation always was her kindness and compassion. In December 2021, on New Year's Eve, Betty White passed away at 99 years old, months away from celebrating her 100th birthday. Throughout her career, Betty White broke barriers and records, from her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame next to her husband Alan Ludden's to her countless accolades and accomplishments. Betty was a game changer. White remains the only woman to have garnered Emmys in every comedic performance category. White also holds a record for the longest span between Emmy nominations and performances. Her first nomination happened all the way back in 1951, and her final was in 2014. White was an actress, producer, philanthropist, activist, honorary mayor of Los Angeles, an honorary forest ranger fulfilling a lifelong dream, and one of the world's most popular and trusted celebrities. When Betty White died on December 31st, 2021, her last word was Alan, whom she longed to reunite with one day. For over 70 years, Betty White lit up the world with a career some actors can only dream of having.